Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to On the Ballot. I'm your host, Norm Leahy, bringing you another episode of our talks about policy and politics around the country. My guest today is someone very special, Dr. Marguerite Roza, who's the director of the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University. We're going to talk about something that is extraordinarily important to communities around the country, but maybe a little bit obscure, if not downright confounding to a lot of people, and that's school budgeting. Marguerite, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, but before we leap into the nuts and bolts of budgeting, which is enough to take hours and hours of discussion, can you give me the elevator pitch on the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown?
Sure. First of all, edunomics, if you haven't heard the word before, it's because it's a made-up word. Education, economics, we mashed them together, and it's we focus on all things money or economic elements of public education. So focus mostly on K-12, but we look at teacher labor markets, how the money is spent, how it's generated, trade-offs, all that kind of stuff.
Education is full of trade-offs, as we know, but
Mhm.
I wanted to leap into our discussion here by looking back just a little bit in time. Everybody knows that if they pay their property taxes, for example, that a lot of that money goes to pay for education. But what they may not understand is that vast sums of money nationally are spent on education, and it's comparable. I think you said to what we spend nationally on defense, somewhat comparable, and now the new hotness in federal spending, service of the national debt, but that education funding comes from many buckets. What are those buckets?
Sure. Yeah. So in the neighborhood, 800, $900 billion. That tends to be about what we're spending on the military. They've kind of been neck and neck depending on which administration is in power. And then yes, that's roughly comparable to what we're spending now just on the interest on the national debt. But education is very different than those other two. Because those other two are all federal money. And public education, actually, only a sliver of it comes from the federal government. Much more of it comes from state governments and local governments. So it's not the way who chooses to spend it is the districts, the school districts, not the federal government. So you have this one big federal budget for defense, and you have 13,000 budgets for public education that are sprinkled all around the country. So it's highly localized in the decision making about how to spend that money.
Right, and in some places, like where I live in Virginia, for example, a school board can decide we want to spend this much money, but then they have to go to the county government to say, "Can you give us this money?" So it's not a direct, "We want to spend it, so we take it." There's funding mechanisms, or how they extract that money is different too, right?
Yeah, it can vary by local area, but in the end, for the most part, the decisions. So what you're asking about is a process like, do you have to get a secondary approval at the county? But when we ask our groups, we do a lot of training. We have a certificate in ed finance that people from all over the country do. And but we ask who decides how to spend the money we have in public education. That technical answer is the school boards. And obviously, they deputize their superintendent and the CFO to draft a budget, but they should be highly engaged in considering the trade-offs. And then they're the ones who ultimately sign that budget. What's interesting is that if we ask school boards that question, they often say, well, it's not us. Yeah, it's actually them, right? So many of them may not be as aware of their role, sometimes because they didn't come in prepared for that, and so on. But that's how the sausage is made.
So you're literally telling me that some school board members don't know that making a budget is part of the job.
That's right. I mean, you could imagine how come, right? Because they get elected because they're mad that the high school start times are too early, or that they're mad about getting a school closed, or they don't want to see sports cut, or they want more music programs. And then they would come in and they sit down in these meetings and they're given big binders, and they may or may not have any training whatsoever on managing hundreds of millions of dollars or sometimes in the billions of dollars. And so oftentimes the district is shepherding through that. We did a study of school board meetings, And overwhelmingly, a majority of school board members don't say a word during the budgeting cycle. And except for I approve or thank you for doing this or things like that, like perfunctory comments.
The perfunctory comments. How
Mhm.
about that? You mentioned billions of dollars, and I want to go back to something that you co-authored in Education Next a couple of years ago, and it was talking about supplementary federal monies. I think what
Relief
was it?
funds. Yeah.
Right, relief funds. It was something what $112 billion or so nationally.
It ended up being there are 3 waves, and all 3 waves ended up being $190 billion that
Okay,
went to school districts in one-time money, sort of as recovery money from COVID, and that was on top
all
of
right.
what they normally spend.
And reading through this article, there was a subhead that hit me right between the eyes, and I'll quote it here. It says, "Half of relief funds are paying for labor, setting the stage for a painful fiscal cliff." And down below, you said, quote, "A sampling of district financials finds that many are using large portions of ESSER funds to, quote, backfill their budgets, essentially covering recurring expenses rather than investing the dollars in anything new." So this was a while ago. The fiscal cliff was coming. They could see it. Where are we now? Have we gone over the cliff, or are we still approaching it?
The cliff is happening. So it'll happen at different, times in different districts. One thing we should note is that it's worse in large urban districts because it got more money. It is worse in districts that are experiencing enrollment decline, and that's what I meant about backfilling. So, when districts grow, they add more staff, spend more money because they get money based on how many kids they have. When they shrink and enrollments decline, the district has to shrink. It has to shed employees, maybe even close some schools, downsize some of its programming. Well, a lot of districts started shrinking about 5 years ago, and that's because birth rates have been down, and there were fewer kindergartners and first graders and second graders. And instead of shrinking, all this money came from the federal government. So they said, we don't have to shrink right now. This is great. We can keep all these excess staff that we have, maybe even hire some more because we got all this federal money. And then, bam, the federal money ran out because it was always one time money. And so this is the year where many districts are having to reconcile with the fact that they have too few kids to sustain the operations they have and too many staff. So a lot of them are doing layoffs. We see that across the country. Many more are doing a hiring freeze and hoping that staff attrition, so when staff normally leave, that will help them shrink their operations, and that's leaving openings in some schools that they're not filling. So your school might not have a math teacher and maybe the ceramics teacher is subbing in. That's not great for kids. Some of them are actually talking about school closures. It's all sort of hitting right now. If you're a district that had pretty healthy reserves, it might hit next year because you can dive into your reserves and cover it for a year. So, but districts are now making hard financial trade-offs when they've been relieved of having to do that because of this excess money for the last 5 years.
And so I know just anecdotally from local news coverage, for example, when the school districts decide even to do something normal, like maybe move attendance boundaries for a specific school, people come out of the woodwork to talk to rant at school boards. Are people following the school budgets the same way? You're closing schools, you're laying off teachers. Is it the same level of interest there?
Well, so the budget process starts in the middle of the winter for the next school year, for the school year starting in September. And the district goes back and forth with the board in a series of meetings throughout the spring, ideally wrestling with trade-offs. Like we have different options. We can cut athletics, we can raise class size, we could close the school, we can get rid of our AP classes, we can walk back a pay raise that we had promised to teachers, we can cut days of school. There are always options, not great options when you're cutting, but there are options. So ideally they've gone through those in the spring, and then it all culminates in May or June when they sign the budget at open board meeting. That's often the time that the parents show up, right? And often it's too late to rebuild that budget and reconsider some of these options. It may be the case that they've already signed contracts for their staff for the next year. And so and you often find parents saying, don't do this, don't close the school, don't get rid of the AP classes or whatever is on the table there. And the only option the board has at that point is to remove that 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 item and just spend reserves. So overspend for the next year, which just make things worse. So anyway, we're seeing a lot of that going on in school districts right now. And really what should have happened was the work of bringing a community along with the choices that they were facing in the prior months. So we could either close a few schools or deplete athletics and the AP classes, or we can walk back a pay raise we had promised, or we can cut a week off of school. And then parents can wrestle with things saying, oh, okay, I didn't realize it was something else was going to have to happen if we don't close the school. And I think they often think the option is leave the school open or close the school and everything else stays, the same. Everything else doesn't stay the same in the long run. So,
Yeah, in the long run, there's and as we know from budgeting for other things, federal, state budgets, there are always groups who are specifically interested in one piece of the budget, and they will fight tooth and nail to keep it.
that's right.
So when you talk about getting rid of, say, after-school sports or AP classes, you're going to mobilize those groups who are very interested in retaining those at all costs. Is that what we're seeing? Are people coming out to fight for their particular piece of the budget?
They are. We've also done focus groups with parents, teachers, and everybody, and they're much more reasonable when they are given really good information on the budget. Why are we facing this? It's not just that administrators are being mean and saying, oh, we'll close a school and inflict pain on our community. It's that we have fewer kids and we're forecasted to have fewer kids going forward. And if we keep your school open, it means that we're going to have one more principal, one more nurse, one more counselor, one more PE teacher. And that means we're going to have to pull from all of the other schools in the district to try to maintain that. So we think districts should be doing more work to bring their communities along. And communities, when faced with trade-offs, are much more logical. But when they hear, no, there's only one option, close the school, then they
Yeah.
think you haven't done your homework. I want to hear the other options, and I'm opposed to that.
Now, speaking of other options, school funding, as you mentioned at the top, part of it does come from the federal government, and as we all know, those who follow education, the current administration is in the process of winding down. I think that's a nice euphemism. The Department of Education, with the ultimate goal, it's I guess of getting rid of it. What's how is what's your take on that? Is it progressing? Is how will that affect things?
Less than you think. So I think there's been a lot of news of the federal government, sort of all the media attention has gone toward the play by play. And believe, every day is another executive order or announcement or a grant that's been cut or something. So I understand why there'd be all this attention on it. But what I think people don't understand is that um, the federal money is less than 10% and of the whole pie there. And first of all, I don't think the Department of Ed is going to go away because they don't have the votes in Congress, and so that I just don't think will happen. But even if it did go away, the bigger programs, the bigger funded programs, would be moved to another agency, I guess. And those federal programs that IDEA and Title One, the two biggest ones, they actually existed before we had a Department of Ed. So they could still exist even if we didn't. Like I said, I do not predict that the Department of Ed will go away, but Title One and IDEA, which are the biggest federal chunks of money, are already funded for the next year at the same level they were for last year. So that money will continue. So when I say less than you think, we're talking about just the tiny flecks of money outside of those two big programs. And some of those, so I think districts will get about as much money as they did in the prior year from the federal government. And could there be a haircut to maybe a competitive grant that some district somewhere applied to? Sure. But mostly that money's going to come. And mostly the big stuff is what's happening around state and local dollars with these enrollment changes that districts are feeling and with the end of the federal relief funds from COVID.
So, as is usually the case, we're spending our attention on the wrong end of the problem.
I think we are, right? And I on the one hand, I understand that districts might be anxious because it's very hard to keep up with all of the stuff. And the news is sometimes conflicting on what it means for school districts. But at the same time, I would be, if I were a district leader, spending a lot more time forecasting my enrollment and the big shifts in enrollment. I mean, there are federal consequences of for districts of things like immigration policy. If you're a district that has a steady stream of immigrant students, that's going to go away, right? Those kids aren't going to be coming at the same rate, and so you might see deeper enrollment declines. Another issue is if our country has a recession, which it's been hovering, kind of between 30 and 60%. I didn't check what it was this morning for that, but if we have a recession potentially precipitated by tariffs, that affects state money because state budgets are very affected by a recession, and that could affect next year or the year after in terms of school resources for kids. And by next year, I mean the 26-27 school year.
So, in the last minute or so we've got left here, Marguerite, let me ask you this. If you're a parent and you're going to out there and, well, you're an educator, assign parents a summer project that they have to show their work for by September, what would you have parents focus on over the summer to get them prepared for the coming school year?
So, first and foremost, a parent should find out whether their kid is on grade level. Survey after survey after survey says parents are not aware that their kid is not at grade level. And we have many, many, like more than half our kids are not at grade level. So I would, in many areas, what I would do is go look up your test scores and find out if your kid is on grade level in reading and math. And if not, I would spend the summer trying to get them back up to grade level. And I would call the district and say, are there opportunities for my child who's not at grade level to do math or reading over the summer? So that would be first and foremost. And if not, I would ask for what kind of supplements my kid will get in the fall, because there are programs that exist and that students have to be demanding of them. But I think the next big thing in terms of the school districts is that the parents should sort of understand what are the options on the table going forward. Is my district a shrinking district? Have they gone and shrunk the staffing appropriately? How do I make sure that my district is keeping the best teachers? And if you're using attrition or a hiring freeze to shrink your district, you may be losing your best teachers and holding on to some of the weaker ones. And the truth is, teacher effectiveness matters more for kids than anything else. So I would be putting pressure on the district to say, I need to know that you know which are your strongest teachers and you're doing everything you can to save those. And maybe, doing the hard work of exiting the teachers who are less effective, because that would be a pro-student policy, not just a pro-teacher policy. So I would say that. And lastly, there are always options. What are the options? And if the district only has one option going forward, they need to go back and do some more work and come up with more options so we can have a discussion about it.
That's a big assignment. So, parents, you're on notice. And remember, show your work.
Yeah.
Yes. Dr. Marguerite Roza, the director of the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University. Thank you for joining us today on the Ballot.
Well, thank you for having me. And if you're interested in this stuff, we do regular 2-day certificate programs. We'd love to have you in the mix.
Me personally, oh man,
You
That means
or anyone else who's listening to this who is just
excellent,
addicted to finance as I am.
excellent. We'll make sure to put a link to that stuff in the show notes afterwards. But until then, maybe seeing you in the classroom. I'm Norm Leahy on the Ballot, and thanks for listening. You can catch us on Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get podcasts. And until next week, we'll see you on the pages of Ballotpedia. Take care.